I've always been a bit of a homebody, not one for late-night adventures. So, what happened last Halloween still rattles me. I'm a firm believer in logic, but some things, well, they defy explanation. I live in a quiet, almost forgotten corner of the state, where the woods are thick and the nights are truly dark. My nearest neighbor is miles away, down a winding, barely paved road. Every year, my friend Lisa throws a small Halloween bonfire at her family's old farmhouse, deep in the valley. It's a rustic affair, just close friends and family. But I always look forward to it. This year, the weather was unusually warm for late October, but a thick fog had rolled in, clinging to the trees and blurring the already dim landscape. The drive to Lisa's was always a bit unnerving, but the fog made it feel like I was driving into a ghost town. My headlights barely cut through the swirling mist. The road is lined with gnarled ancient trees, and there's this old, dilapidated church about halfway there. It's been abandoned for decades, but always gives me the creeps. As I approach the church, I notice something odd. A figure, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon, stood at the edge of the churchyard. They were completely still, just a dark shape against the fog. I slowed down, try and make out any details, but the fog was too thick. It was tall, slender, and seemed to be wearing a long, dark coat. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. I hesitated, debating whether to stop, but something about the figure's stillness made me uneasy. I decided to keep driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I arrived at Lisa's, parked my car, and joined the others around the bonfire. The party was lively, filled with laughter and spooky stories, but I couldn't quite relax. Image of the figure at the church lingered in my mind. As the night wore on, the fog thickened and the temperature dropped. The party started to wind down. People began to leave, and soon only a few of us remained. I decided to head home. As I got into my car, I noticed that the fog was even denser than before. My headlights barely illuminated the road. The drive back was slow and tense. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. As I approached the old church, I held my breath. The figure was gone, but the feeling of unease intensified. Then I heard a faint tapping sound, like something hitting the roof of my car. I looked up, couldn't see anything through the fog. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent. I started to panic. I pressed down on the gas pedal, desperate to get away. But the tapping turned into a scraping, a harsh, metallic sound that seemed to be coming from all around me. I glanced in my rear-view mirror and saw a dark shape just beyond the reach of my headlights, moving with me. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was following me. I sped up, but the scraping grew louder, faster. It sounded like claws dragging across the metal of my car. Suddenly, my car lurched, and I felt a flat tire. I pulled over, my hand shaking. The fog was so thick, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I got out of the car, my phone flashlight trembling in my hand. The tires were slashed, deep, jag cuts that looked like they were made by something sharp and powerful. I knew I was trapped. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Then I heard a voice, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from the fog itself. You shouldn't have left. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I turned my flashlight toward the voice, but saw nothing. You're not welcome here. The voice was closer now, just beyond the edge of the fog. I turned and ran, stumbling through the darkness, back towards Lisa's house. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, heavy and relentless. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached. I reached Lisa's house, pounded on the door, and collapsed onto the porch. Lisa and her family rushed out, their faces filled with concern. I told them what had happened, my voice trembling. They called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was nothing to be found. The next day, the police found my car, but there was no sign of the figure. They checked the old church, but it was empty. They found deep gouges in the church's old wood, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. I still don't know what I saw that night, or what followed me, but I know one thing. I'll never drive that road alone again. especially on Halloween. And I will never stop at that church. Sometimes I still hear a faint tapping in the night, and I know that whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting,